For 24 years, she silenced attorneys and destroyed lives, until one man flipped the script and had her arrested in her own courtroom. The air inside the Jefferson County Courthouse in Birmingham, Alabama, felt thick, not from the humidity outside, but from something heavier, an unspoken truth that had settled into the walls over decades. Everyone who walked through those heavy oak doors knew how things worked in Judge Meredith Langford's courtroom. She was the kind of judge who rarely looked over her reading glasses, her sharp eyes cutting through attorneys like they were nothing more than irritations. She spoke in a measured tone, never raising her voice, but the authority in it crushed anyone who dared push back. Langford had been on the bench for 24 years, long enough to leave a legacy, not the kind carved into plaques or celebrated in law schools, but the kind whispered about in hallways, discussed in hushed tones at bar association meetings. Attorneys, especially black attorneys, knew exactly what they were up against when their case landed in her courtroom. The rulings always seemed to lean one way. The objections she sustained or overruled followed a pattern no one could prove, but everyone understood. Today, that pattern was about to be tested. Darnell Hayes stepped into the courtroom, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. He had been here before, but today was different. He wasn't just another defense attorney standing before Judge Langford. He wasn't just another name on the docket. Today he had something she didn't see coming. Darnell was 48 years old, a man who had built his career on taking the cases no one wanted. His reputation stretched far beyond Alabama, and his ability to tear apart a prosecution's case made him a target for people like Langford. But that never stopped him. What did stop him, just for a second, was the look in her eyes when he walked toward the defense table. She already hated him, not because of the case, not because of anything he had said, but because he was him. Darnell felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about his client, Tyrone Wilkes, a man falsely accused of armed robbery. This wasn't just about proving innocence. This was about something much bigger, and he wasn't leaving this courtroom without making that clear. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Langford said, barely acknowledging him as she scanned the paperwork in front of her. "You're already on thin ice in my courtroom. Don't waste my time today." There was no reason for her to say that. They hadn't even started. Darnell tightened his grip on his briefcase, but kept his expression unreadable. "I'll try not to, Your Honor." Judge Langford smirked. "Good, because I have a full docket and I don't need theatrics." She turned to the prosecution, an eager young assistant district attorney named Philip Calloway, fresh out of law school, trying too hard to impress the wrong people. "The state is ready, Your Honor," Calloway said, casting a smug glance in Darnell's direction. Of course they were ready. They were always ready when the case was stacked against a black man. Darnell's client sat beside him, hands folded, shoulders hunched forward, the kind of posture that belonged to someone who had been in the system too long. He had seen too much, heard too much, lost too much. Darnell leaned in slightly. "We're ready too," he said, loud enough for the whole courtroom to hear. Judge Langford exhaled through her nose. "Let's get this over with." The trial began, but it wasn't a trial. It was a performance, and Judge Langford had the starring role. Every objection Darnell raised was dismissed with barely a thought. Every time Calloway stumbled over a legal argument, she guided him like a teacher correcting a favorite student. The jury noticed, the gallery noticed, but no one was brave enough to say anything except Darnell. He studied her, the way her lips curled when he spoke, the way she barely concealed her contempt. It wasn't just bias, it was something worse, something he had spent years preparing for. But the courtroom didn't know that yet. Darnell had been in hostile courtrooms before, but this was different. Judge Langford wasn't even trying to hide it. Every time he spoke, she cut him off. Every time he raised a valid argument, she waved it away like a fly buzzing near her ear. The courtroom had its own rhythm. Lawyers spoke, judges ruled, the jury listened. But in this courtroom, Langford had decided the verdict before the trial even began. Darnell caught the jury's discomfort in the way they shifted in their seats. Even some of the white jurors who might have come in with their own preconceived notions couldn't ignore what was happening, but Judge Langford didn't care. She doubled down, her words sharper each time she addressed him. "Mr. Hayes, you're testing my patience. she snapped. Mr. Hayes, if you raise one more baseless objection, I'll hold you in contempt. Mr. H. Darnell turned his head slowly, meeting the judge's eyes. This was too blatant, too obvious. I'd like the witness to answer, Your Honor. I said move on, Langford snapped. Darnell didn't blink. For the record, Your Honor, you are preventing the witness from clarifying his own statement. Langford's face twitched. I'm warning you, Mr. Hayes. Darnell smiled just slightly. I understand, Your Honor. He turned back to the witness. No further questions. He walked back to the defense table, slow and deliberate. He could feel the tension in the room shifting again, twisting, tightening. Langford knew she'd lost control of the room, and Darnell knew it was time. He wasn't here just to win this case. He was here to end her. He reached into his briefcase, his fingers brushing against the stack of documents that would change everything. Just as he did, the courtroom doors swung open. Something was about to happen that Judge Langford never saw coming. The heavy double doors of the courtroom burst open, and the sound alone was enough to shift every pair of eyes away from the witness stand. Two federal agents in dark suits strode in, their movements crisp, purposeful. The courtroom went still, a silence so deep it swallowed the air itself. Darnell didn't react. He simply smoothed out his tie and folded his hands neatly on the defense table. Judge Langford's eyes flickered with confusion, then irritation. What is the meaning of this? One of the agents, a tall man with a clipped demeanor, flashed a badge as he spoke. Judge Meredith Langford, we need to speak with you immediately. Langford's jaw tightened. I am in the middle of a trial. The agent didn't budge. It's urgent. Darnell could see the confusion morph into something dangerously close to fear in her expression. Just a flicker of it, quickly buried under a mask of judicial arrogance. She squared her shoulders. This is highly inappropriate. Whatever this is, it will have to wait until I've concluded these proceedings. The other agent stepped forward, this time addressing the courtroom at large. This is a matter of federal interest. It cannot wait. A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. Even the jury, sworn to impartiality, couldn't hide their curiosity. Philip Calloway, the prosecutor, cleared his throat awkwardly. Should we take a recess, Your Honor? Langford's fingers curled into the bench. No, she said, her voice sharp, too sharp. We are not taking a recess. The defense has wasted enough of this court's time, and I refuse to allow— Judge Langford, the first agent interrupted, we have a warrant for your arrest. A collective gasp rippled through the room. For the first time in 24 years, Judge Langford lost control of her courtroom. Darnell let the moment breathe, let the weight of it sink into every corner of the room. Then slowly, deliberately, he stood. He turned, looking at the jury, the gallery, the reporters scribbling frantically, and finally he faced her. Your Honor, he said, I believe you just denied my motion for a mistrial, but it seems this trial is now the least of your concerns. Judge Langford's face drained of color. The lead agent stepped forward, pulling a folded sheet of paper from his jacket. Meredith Langford, you are being arrested under suspicion of bribery, abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights under federal law. The room exploded. The gallery erupted in voices, some shocked, some delighted, some stunned into silence. The jury members sat frozen, their eyes bouncing between Darnell and the woman on the bench. Langford looked at the agents, then at the paper, then at Darnell. For the first time, she truly saw him, not just as another attorney arguing a case before her, but as the man who had been waiting for this moment. Mr. Hayes, Langford said, her voice no longer sharp but unsteady. Darnell picked up his briefcase and stepped forward, locking eyes with her. I told you, he said, calm and unwavering. I follow the law, even when the law fails people like me. The lead agent moved to the bench. Judge, we need you to stand. She didn't move. Then finally she did. When the agent snapped the cuffs around her wrists, the courtroom wasn't just watching, they were witnessing a reckoning. But this wasn't over yet. The click of the handcuffs echoed through the courtroom, sharp and final. For 24 years, Judge Meredith Langford had ruled this room with an iron grip. Attorneys feared her. Defendants knew they didn't stand a chance. The system had protected her for decades. turning a blind eye to her rulings, her bias, the thinly veiled contempt she held for people like Darnell Hayes. But now she stood in the very spot where she had condemned countless men before. Wrists bound, eyes frantic, power slipping. The courtroom was electric, a rare, once-in-a-lifetime kind of moment that no one had expected to see. The jury, the gallery, even Philip Calloway, the young prosecutor who had been so eager to please her, all stared in stunned silence. Darnell let the moment stretch. He had spent years building toward this, gathering every piece of evidence, tracking every bribe, every unethical ruling, every case she had manipulated. He had been patient, playing the long game, knowing that one day the weight of her corruption would become too heavy to ignore. Today was that day. One of the federal agents pulled a folded sheet of paper from his jacket and began reading the charges aloud. Meredith Langford, you are under arrest for multiple violations of the Civil Rights Act, bribery, obstruction of justice, and abuse of judicial power. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Langford finally found her voice. This is outrageous, she hissed. The lead agent didn't even blink. You can take that up with your lawyer. A wave of murmurs swept through the gallery. The reporters scrambled to capture every detail. The way Langford's hands shook, the way her once imposing presence seemed so small now. She turned to Darnell. You, she spat, her voice laced with bitterness. Darnell met her gaze unflinching. He had flipped the script, not just for Tyrone Wilkes, but for every life she destroyed. The courtroom watched as the agents led her away, her reign unraveling in real time. With something between rage and disbelief, Judge Langford spat, This is your doing. Darnell lifted his chin slightly. This is justice, he corrected. For the first time in his career, the balance had shifted. Langford tried to compose herself, but it was useless. The power she had wielded for so long was gone. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. For years she had sat in judgment, handing out hollow lectures about accountability and respect for the law. Now she stood before the very system she had abused. The agents moved her toward the doors, but not before one final humiliation. A court officer, someone who had worked under her for years, who had once bowed to her authority without question, held the door open for her, like she was just another defendant. Langford hesitated, then stepped through. The doors slammed shut behind her, and just like that, she was gone. The courtroom was left in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over the room. Darnell exhaled slowly, letting his hands rest on the defense table. His client, Tyrone Wilkes, turned to him, his expression a mix of shock and awe. Man, Tyrone muttered, shaking his head. I thought people like her never paid for what they did. Darnell glanced at the empty judge's bench. They do, he said, eventually. But the real lesson, that's still to come. The courtroom had never felt this alive. The gallery, still in shock, erupted into hushed conversations. Some whispered in disbelief, others in barely contained satisfaction. The jury looked around at each other, as if silently confirming they had all just witnessed the same thing. Darnell remained still. He had fought battles in court before, but this was different. He had played the long game, knowing that Langford's corruption was too deep, too bold, too reckless to remain hidden forever. After years of patience, gathering evidence, waiting for her to make one final mistake, justice had finally arrived. And yet Tyrone Wilkes was still in handcuffs. Judge Langford was gone, but the trial she had stacked against him was still unfinished. Darnell turned, leveling his gaze at Philip Calloway, the young prosecutor who had once looked so confident, so sure of himself under Langford's protection. Not anymore. Now Calloway was pale, his hands gripping the edges of his notes like a drowning man clinging to a life raft. He had just lost his safety net. Darnell cleared his throat. Your Honor, he said, directing his words toward the replacement judge, who had just been rushed in from another courtroom to take over the proceedings. Given the recent developments, I move for an immediate dismissal of all charges against my client. The new judge, an older black man with graying hair and a reputation for fairness, folded his hands together. On what grounds, Mr. Hayes? Darnell turned to the jury. On the grounds that this entire trial was poisoned from the start. Judge Langford's arrest proves what we've known all along. She was never impartial, and neither were her rulings. This case was manipulated, evidence was ignored, and my client was never given a fair trial. He let the words sink in, then turned back to the judge. And now that the woman who orchestrated this injustice is in handcuffs, the only thing left to do is undo the damage she caused. The new judge leaned back slightly, studying Darnell with the kind of measured patience that only experience could provide. Then slowly he nodded. I agree. A heavy pause fell over the room. The charges against Tyrone Wilkes are dismissed. Bailiff, remove his restraints. For a second, no one moved. Then Tyrone let out a breath, one he had been holding for years. The courtroom officer unlocked the handcuffs, and for the first time in a long time, Tyrone's hands were his own again. The moment was thick with emotion. Even Calloway didn't object. He just sat there staring at the desk, looking like a man who had lost something much bigger than a trial. Tyrone rubbed his wrists, then turned to Darnell, his voice low. I don't even know what to say. Darnell clapped a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to say anything. Today the justice system had actually worked, not because it was built that way, but because someone had fought to make it happen. Tyrone stood, looking around the courtroom that had nearly swallowed him whole. Then, without another word, he walked out. Darnell followed, the weight of what had just happened pressing against his chest.